Josh. The title is Why Violent Revolution Was Once a Way, but Organized Mass Militant Nonviolence is the Future. Alan is the author of many books. His latest book is Black Patriots and Loyalists, Fighting for Emancipation in the War of Independence. It's University of Chicago, right? Published this year. So I turn it over to Alan. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Chad, and thank you everyone for coming. This is a deep subject and one that has riven activists for a long time. There is a superficial version of it, which is, you know, some people of good conscience who want to protest the war in Iraq, make sure that there are 5 of them so that everything is under control, and go and work it out with the police, and they sit down and they get taken away. That's nonviolence. And Trotsky once said this was Quaker vegetarian prattle. And then there are many people who are frustrated, and they don't think much about how to influence other people, and they engage in forms of, you could call it militancy. I mean, sometimes it really is. Like, for a while, the Palestinians made the mistake in fighting against the hideous oppression of the Israeli government of sending out kids to blow themselves up. And they would blow themselves up mainly where they could reach people. So they would blow themselves up on a bus, and on a bus, you know, women, children, people who have nothing to do with it. So actually you could say that policy, that far from it being an heroic thing, frankly, the cops might have thought of it before. That is to say, it strengthened the worst forces in Israel. And it's very common here. There's a lot of militancy among anarchists here, and some sharp demonstrations, but often there is much against the passersby as they are against the police, and they don't bring down the system. Now, Occupy has done a great deal to bring down the system. Obama would not have recovered himself, because he started out as a sort of rank-and-file guy, and then he became the president of an extraordinary system dominated by the 1/10%, $1 trillion military budget, 1,280 bases around the world, and a bunch of flower cluster new bases where they can just kill people in small. And it messed him up quite a lot. And I think that he recovered himself because of Occupy. I think that this campaign, which is very modest, because the political system is controlled by the elite a lot. That is, if you don't have mass protest, you get what the elite wants. I mean, they may put a little other face on it, but not too much. So, it was Occupy which made the issue of the 99.9% a real issue. And the Republicans have chosen to nominate an insecure advertisement for the top 1,000th of 1%. A man who started Bain Capital by going to the murderers in Salvador of ordinary people and getting his money from them. And if you think Sheldon Adelson is any different, look again. So I would imagine everybody here is pretty committed to doing something about this. And though I am also a professor and an academic, I have been doing something about this all my life. And I consider it the most important thing. And I also learned a long time ago, actually from reading a lot of Lenin, that you never know who's in the room, and you never know who's going to do more than you. So you better not get upset if 10,000 people don't turn out. And correspondingly, if you happen to be Charlie Chaplin in modern times, I don't know if any of you have seen that movie, and you pick up a traffic flag, and it happens it's a revolutionary situation, a ton of people come out behind you, you better not get too high on yourself, not that Charlie Chaplin did. But, you know, a lot of radicals tend to, oh, we let a big group. And where is it now? So, I will actually mention one thing that I just put up on my blog, democratic individuality. And I will pass around the China sheet for anybody who's interested. On Gandhi, Socrates, and Satyagraha. Satyagraha was Gandhi's word for nonviolent resistance. And it happens that Gandhi translated Plato's Apology into Gujarati, and that he left some remarks, because I don't read no Gujarati, in English. And they're actually, the sixth part of them is up on the web, so you can see that Gandhi felt that a serious person who was going to take up nonviolence, if he were a Hindu, should be willing to give his life to defend a Muslim against the Hindu mob. That idea is Karl Marx's idea of internationalism, which I've written a lot about. There's no distinction. And he admired Socrates. What he said Satyagraha was a form of seeking the truth. And what he admired Socrates for, Socrates was very good at asking questions and not so good at bullshitting. So he didn't tell you all it was true. He had just asked questions which made it embarrassing if you decided that you were hot stuff and you knew fully what was true. And there are enormous commonalities. Anyway, it's not a well-known fact about Gandhi. I've written a lot about Gandhi and Socrates. Socrates is thought to be the reactionary who motivated, for example, Martin Heidegger, who conceived his Nazism after studying Plato a lot from the right. And Leo Strauss here, who was responsible for commander-in-chief power in the Republicans, and now Obama calls it executive power. And the authority to go murder Americans abroad, or shoot drones off into a dozen countries without ever taking credit for it, or send the Joint Special Operations Command not to take out Osama bin Laden, which is, I think, something good. It's very rare I can say that in American foreign policy. In my adult lifetime, I can think of perhaps one other thing that I think America has done in international politics that's good. But that might be stretching the point. The other one seems to be more debatable. But they have a dozen missions a night. They have 60,000 forces. And they go all over the world. Well, I think that there's something in looking into these things more deeply. It is common today on the left. An editor of New Left Review, Perry Anderson, has written 2 very good pieces in the Times Literary Supplement. They're all 70 pages long. And they're an attack on Gandhi. And the motivation for the attack is, in England, people kind of worship Gandhi. Some people. And they censor the press, the mainstream press. So actually a good critical book was written about, Gandhi had many, many flaws. There are no human beings without flaws. Anybody can tell, the saints don't exist, right? If we're going to change the world, it's going to be up to us. Nobody superhuman's going to do it. So Einstein said, it'll be hard for people to believe that such a man walked among us, right, Gandhi. But that doesn't mean that Gandhi was also great in a variety of ways. But Anderson's slant is Satyagraha didn't accomplish anything. And you could think today, I'm in correspondence with my friend Hassan, who has told me a little bit about Egypt. And Arab Spring was one of the great things and one of the great examples of nonviolence, in the sense that people took Tahrir Square, and while they fought some against the thuggery against them, the regime murdered about 800 people last statistic I saw. That means probably several thousand. But compared to the kinds of massacres which ordinarily occur, fairly limited. You go for violence, and boy, the U.S. armed them to the teeth, right? Every tear gas shell in Cairo, produced by Consolidated Systems, Inc., made in the United States. They had a lot of weapons. They could have killed a lot of people. I noticed that Mubarak fell, and I noticed that the wall, which Egypt had a part of, which was committing genocide against the people of Gaza, came down. But now, unfortunately, the Muslim League has come to power, Christians are attacked, Hamas, I guess, is upset at the enormous nonviolent international success of the boycott and divestment movement. So they actually just apparently sent some people into Egypt and murdered 14 soldiers. And Egypt is closing down the wall of Gaza and doing various reactionary things. And once again, the Israeli so-called intelligence has organized a number of antidotes to other things that they don't like. And had they organized this, it would not be surprising. It's a very dangerous thing to take up a kind of violence which turns lots of people who would otherwise be for you against you. Lenin called it left-wing communism and infantile disorder. And it's actually worth reading that pamphlet because a lot of people said, gee whiz, we're going to make a revolution. We're going to be like Regis Debray and Che, and we're going to have a FOCO, and everybody's going to be like Charlie Chaplin and shape up behind us, and it's going to be great. All we have to do is shoot somebody who's bad, and that'll do it, you know. And there are a lot of people who are bad. So you can persuade yourself, you shoot somebody who's bad, everybody else is going to think they're bad the way you do. So, if I may say, by the way, in this crazy society, with Fox News and other things, Mitt Romney, who should get 1/10 of 1% of the vote, if he's lucky, on a good day, may become president, and may not even become president through cheating, quite possibly. So I will just say, if you want to make a revolution in America, probably you have to think out, well, gee whiz, he's not a good human being. And there are other people who, you know, head of Goldman Sachs, not a good human being. If you think that there's major injustice there, how many people are foreclosed? How many people are unemployed? How many people are fishing in dumpsters, not because they're anarchists trying to make a life around the edges, but because they have no other life? How many people is that in the United States of America? Or in England with the Olympics? A lot of people. And it goes down from there, often. And China looks pretty good now, because, you know, a lot of poverty in China, a lot of poverty in China. But China's on the way up, and the US is on the way down. So, it's really important to try to think through the question about how you reach out to people. Any serious revolutionary movement, any mass movement, will use a lot of nonviolent tactics. You can't get to a revolutionary situation before a lot of people become discontent with the powers that be. The powers that be have to be a little broken and unable to function. And by the way, this place is a really good example of broken and not very able to function. I mean, they elected Obama and they could have gone for green energy, and instead they're so selfish that they want to steal everything. They have tax laws by the Democrats and the Republicans so that, you know why Romney's afraid of releasing his taxes? I mean, he may have paid none. He paid very little. He has $100 million in an IRA somewhere. There's a theory that the guy obeyed the law, but I will just say, he says that himself. The law is very corrupt, written for the top 0.0001 of 1%. But nobody's looked. I would bet that there are quite a few things to be found in Mr. Romney's tax returns. That's a creation of the Democrats as well as the Republicans. So this question of how to pursue a serious movement and to think about it is actually a deep question. I was once quite compelled by the Chinese Revolution. I had lived in Pakistan, and I had experienced enormous poverty. I've written a poem about this, but I once was in Dhaka, in what is now Bangladesh, and I was walking along the street, and there was this beautiful little girl, about 4 years old, dressed in a sari, and she was begging, and her wrists were snapped, so she'd be more effective begging. And I lost it, and actually I was looking for the pimp to do something to her, because it just seemed to be like, beyond bearing. And it has seemed to me beyond bearing ever since. I could give you the whole thing. My father was trying to reform Pakistan with works programs which would help the poor, and he did some things. But capitalism in Pakistan was so ugly, and the situation of most people so desperate. And I went to the beach, 1,000 people, 1,000 kids would come out and they'd yell as my parents drove, or we had a driver. My parents sat in the car and I sat in the car. The kids were screaming, "Bakshish sahab, bakshish sahab, give us some money." There wasn't enough sand on the beach, the equivalent to give them money. You didn't have a program to change that. It wasn't going to change. So you get, in Pakistan, while I was there, Mao, 5 volumes. And I think my father had been a Marxist when he was a kid before he became Keynesian. And I think I memorized the Communist Manifesto, and I read most of it. I read a lot of it. It was printed. And I learned some things from it. They meant more to me later than they did then. But I would just say it was easy to sympathize with the Chinese Revolution because they were attacked, not only by Chiang Kai-shek, but by the Japanese invasion, the Japanese fascists, in so horrific a way. In 3 provinces in North China, according to Chalmers Johnson, when he was still with the intelligence services and he was a leading political scientist. In the winter of 1940-41, the Japanese said, "Gorillas are fish that swim in the sea of the people," as Mao says. "Therefore, we shall drain the water." And Johnson says they murdered 20 million people. That's a lot of people. Now, by the way, cut it in half, it's still a lot of people, right? I don't know about who collected the statistics. I don't much care. It's a lot of people. The Chinese Revolution was an heroic effort to change this, as was the Vietnamese Revolution. But my stepdaughter was just in Vietnam, and my youngest son is right now, today, on an exchange in Shanghai. And neither of these places would strike one as a great illustration of communism, nor is socialism at all popular among a lot of people. And a lot of the stories have to do with sheer cruelty. That is to say, during the Cultural Revolution, there are a lot of people who were professors in the Communist Party. And the thought was a lot of professors have bourgeois habits and live above the people and don't want to talk to people. And they say the truth about it. They're scholar tyrants. And you can find them here. They're people who want to talk at you, and you're going to copy it down, and what you know is what you imbibe from the great professor. And this even is true in graduate school. And it's completely corrupt, and it shouldn't be true in grade school. It's not a way to teach. No discussion, no teaching. Right? I mean, I would just say from my own point of view, I would just say, I know what I think, at least roughly, because I figure out some things talking, but really, it's boring to hear myself talk. So I would prefer a conversation, and this is a big issue we're discussing. Anyway, there are a lot of simple cruelties. A lot of people were put to death or harassed or treated badly. A lot of communists. My son read a book by a woman whose father was a leading communist. And he got his books taken away and got beaten up. very mean stuff. And by the way, the line of argument from now used to be, it wasn't like Stalin. Because Stalin murdered everything he disagreed with. So Mao was better. And that's why Deng Xiaoping survived. And there's some truth in that. But actually, one of the things about mass movements is once you get into committing violence against people, it's very hard to stop. And very often you just go cross-eyed at somebody, or if you don't, somebody else does. Or you're not crazy, but if you've ever been in a radical movement for any period of time, if you haven't met the crazy people, maybe you should look in the mirror. Right? I mean, we're all crazy in a certain way, right? But one of the main reasons radicals fail is they get these huge divisions. Right? Occupy succeeded by occupation. The picture of the girl being sprayed by the police officer in New York helped break the silence of the New York Times. The little marches here, taking the name of Occupy, which trashed passersby, if they had been good, they would have been parasitic. Which is all right. One has to go to where people are. But the other thing is, they weren't good, and a lot of people thought they were Occupy. And you might think about it, anybody sympathetic to it, because I will just say, a lot of harm was done. When people couldn't sell their wares to their little shops out on Saturday, when Fuck the Police went by, they said, that's Occupy. They didn't like it. I had a student in my nonviolence class went down and she followed the march and collected all the information about how people felt about it. And she gave us a pretty terrible talk when she came back. And since I've been a violent revolutionary most of my life, and I'm not unsympathetic to violent revolution, it is not, and by the way, my grandfather was an anarchist. It is not the case that I would knock stuff that was just or decent because it was violent. I like John Brown, for example, and I'm sympathetic with William Lloyd Garrison, but anybody who thinks that William Lloyd Garrison's form of nonviolence, he was attacked, he was a nice guy, he publicized against slavery. But he himself, after John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, gave a talk about why John Brown was good. Even he was convinced. So if you study the thing and you're not convinced, you know, good luck. However, if we are to think seriously about this, we have to get beyond defeats, and we have to get beyond caricature, and we have to think for ourselves. 40 years ago, the Vietnamese triumphed against American imperialism. The Chinese Revolution won in 1949. It's a long time ago. Since then, there have been a lot of things like Arab Spring and Eastern Europe, and there has been the great civil rights movement here, which had a violent strain. The rebellions in American cities were a bit violent. Malcolm X was good to talk about violence, but Malcolm X actually cooperated with Martin Luther King, be it noted. And there was a very complicated interplay between violence and nonviolence in that movement. And the nonviolent movement had a series of tactics, some of which were taught by James Wilson and other people who went to India and learned from Gandhians and came back and talked about how you integrate the lunch counters. Now let's imagine Arab Spring with the people actually talking about nonviolence and not reading the government agent Gene Sharp's compendium of tactics, but actually trying to discuss for themselves examples of movements like, how come the mothers that disappeared got so far? Or, now I've forgotten the name, Asma Mahfouz. How come this great woman on YouTube said about the murder of her friend, I'm going out to protest on National Police Day, and the men in my household are telling me not to. And she called them on everything that was wrong with them, and then she said, so I'm going out there. And she looks in the camera and she says, be men. And by the way, for nonviolence, if you happen to like serious manliness, Martin Luther King, they tried to kill him when he was 26 in Birmingham, and about 40 times they tried to kill him. Between then when they did kill him. And they tried to kill his family. You want courage. Maybe there's some better example in the world than Martin Luther King. Maybe. But I wouldn't bet on it. And I will just say about it that it's the deeper effort to change things which really amounts to something. That is, we don't get too high on yourself or too low on yourself, and you really keep at it, which is really the main thing. Arab Spring was enormously hopeful. Occupy is enormously hopeful. The indignados in Spain are going to this day. There is so huge a protest outside the parliament, the Syntagma in Athens. I was there last summer teaching a course on the trial and death of Socrates. Well, 50,000 people were having discussions into the night, and they know from participatory democracy, you know, they have some in Greece. It wasn't everybody, but they know from participatory democracy, and they had fabulous discussions. Well, supposing they got the idea, which they did to some extent, of actually blocking people from going into the Syntagma, which you can barely get into when they keep the public out. It's the most corrupt, I mean, just after a military dictatorship, it's the most constrained parliamentary system in the world. They could have done better. They've had millions of people demonstrate at various times about this. But the ability to do better depends on some people who have the idea and can organize for it. And one of the great innovations of Occupy is this idea. Roshan was embarrassed because I introduced him as a leader to something. Because he was. But this is a movement with many leaders. And this is not a movement which has public spokespeople who are grand. Right? This is a movement that proceeds through discussion. This is an extremely hopeful thing. You know, the Wall Street Journal and other thuggish organizations talk down Occupy. They talk down Occupy from the beginning. And Occupy do these enormous things. Enormous. They've been stealing Bill Clinton just like Bush. From poor people all the way through. Bill Clinton did a few more decent things, by the way. But, you know, he also committed war crimes in Iraq. He pursued the Iraq boycott. So you want the list of bad things. You know, there are no good heads of the empire. I mean, Barack is as close as we're going to see in our lifetime. I find him very likable. I've never liked him as president. But having said that, the way things will change is by people getting together and figuring out how to answer this question, how to involve large numbers of people, what issues to take up. If you get several thousand people, what do? Do you actually do something after the march? Well, do you have the most militant people sit down and block traffic? Is that a good idea? Does that accomplish much? Hey, what about really going and protesting against Hickenlooper, who doesn't, you know, we don't have any issue here of busting the state workers union because we don't have one. We don't have collective bargaining with Hickenlooper, right? So it is true that the yo-yo for the Koch brothers in Wisconsin, Scott Walker, is worse than Hickenlooper, sort of. But it is also true that the Occupy movement could have done much more to publicize ways in which Hickenlooper, embarrassingly, is like Scott Walker, and to do something to further everybody's understanding of why this has to change. And one of the things that means, and it happened in the civil rights movement in Nashville, the head of the city got so, they had a number of violent actions by the police, and the Ku Klux Klan blew up an organizer's house, and they blew up most of the hospital for black people next door. They broke all the windows. And there was a march of about 4,000 people. And there was a very fiery preacher who was denouncing the mayor, Mayor West. And Diane Nash, who was one of the great leaders of this movement, actually asked him a question. She asked him the question not as the mayor, but as a man. She asked him, do you think it is right that stores want us to come in and buy their goods, but will not service at their lunch counters? And he answered, no, as a man, I do not. Which is the jujitsu of nonviolence. It is the idea that a lot of people you don't think have souls. When Eldridge Cleaver was a rapist in prison, if you'd said Eldridge Cleaver was a great soul, probably not. When he wrote Soul on Ice, a lot of us read it, thought it was pretty good. Learned a lot from it. You don't know who's going to change. And one of the great things about nonviolence is you don't think yourself you're so good that is in some situations you couldn't do bad things. The proof that you won't do a bad thing in the situations you don't do, right? Not that you think you won't do it. In life, you have to prove it. And a lot of people who really are pretty good and may go on to do some good things, when they get in a situation like that, do some bad things, right? A great virtue of nonviolence with Gandhi is you think everybody has a soul. I read these Anderson pieces. I like Anderson. They're really corrupt. He doesn't even notice the story. Oh, he's also, by the way, an English radical who apologizes for the British Empire in India and blames Gandhi and Nehru for the violence. And they actually printed this. And I will just say, you know, I've been a Marxist a long time. There are 60 million varieties of Marxist. Now I'm a radical Democrat. I don't know what it means exactly, but I know it means one thing. It means that when you're in the center of racism, you don't criticize the people who are victimized by your power, you criticize your power. You don't say, gee whiz, those Pakistani teenagers, they just didn't know when they were trying to do something about drones, how to talk to the American Congress, which is made up of great important people, and really they're the problem and not Barack Obama and these Democratic neocons. Not a chance. And that's his article, 70 pages in the London Review of Books. So I think Gandhi has been sufficiently trapped. You can learn more from King than from Gandhi. King was no angel either. He did some very bad things. He opposed the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. That was really dumb. The last year of his life, he was more radical than most people will ever get to be. And he's worth reading. So I would just say, look at this from the point of view of it's really necessary to think this stuff out of a deep way. And as a movement, it is possible for us to do this. And if there are good arguments that you can really organize the same kind of movement now did, let's hear them. But I would just say, the British killed a lot more people in Kenya than they did in India about the movement, except for what they did about politicians. The reason they killed them was they said, Mau, they're dangerous. We need to shoot them up. And a lot of people supported it. When you have a non-violent movement, even though they do horrible things, and by the way, the first people they killed are innocents. So it's one of the most unbearable things about non-violence. Right? That is all of one's instincts cry out for vengeance. And also, by the way, as a leader, I personally don't want to, bring innocent people into getting themselves hurt. That's not a bright idea. But nonviolence is a way forward, or will be a way forward if people devote themselves to it. Maybe one last point of that. American militarism has pretty well destroyed the world. In the Middle East, we have planted depleted uranium twice. In the first Gulf War, there were about 100 Americans who died, but the Americans, being high on racism, they went to the tanks and they fished out stuff along the trail of death, all the people in the tanks that had blown up with these weapons. They had turned the people in the tanks into crispy critters, burned up. And they got the weaponry. They got little things. And it was full of depleted uranium. And they came back to the United States and their children had the same birth defects that showed up in Iraq. Big eyes, big ears, hands, no arms, shoulders. 100 people had died in the first Gulf War, but by the beginning of the second Gulf War, over 10,000 had died. The Pentagon under Rumsfeld said, it isn't depleted uranium, it isn't depleted uranium. The World Society in England will tell you it isn't. And, the World Society in England wasn't Tony Blair, it wasn't Bush's poodle. And they said, no. There's really good evidence that it is depleted uranium. And we spent a second war poisoning that whole area. And we're going to live with the consequences in homelessness and disease here for the next 50 years. And we've done global warming too. And if you know, like this summer, if you want to take these two things together, if you think the planet can sustain a lot more violence, good luck. But I would just say, probably thinking of another way is another way.
Great, thank you. So, yeah, we have about a half hour for questions. What we're going to do is we're going to use regular Occupy procedures, which is we do a stack. So if you want to ask a question, if you can raise your hand. Therese over there by the door is going to take stack. So what she's going to do is when she points to you, she's going to give you a number. You remember your number, and then we go in that order, right, to ask questions. So, questions?
One, you can go. It's comments or
yeah, sure. So,
yeah,
just as long as, please keep in mind that there are a lot of people and comments are going to grow, and so if you can just be as brief as possible, but sure, comments, of course.
Just two things. One is if people are interested and you haven't seen a book that came out last year called Why Civil Resistance Works. It was a pretty interesting academic study as to why, through looking at violent and nonviolent overthrows, big stuff, not kind of smaller issues, but why nonviolence has succeeded, and it's pretty interesting. And then the second thing was...
Give the authors' names.
Eric Chenoweth and I don't remember the other woman's name. Chenoweth is...
Erica is now my colleague in the School of International Studies.
It's a good one and a needed one. The other thing is, I'm not sure if you were being sarcastic, but you mentioned Gene Sharp as a government agent. Were you being sarcastic, or were you?
No, I think he is.
So I would.
But let's not discuss that. I'll tell you, for the sake of argument, I'll give it over because look, unless you have some general point to make.
Well, my point is that I would caution you from saying something like that because although someone writes something, his work, there are many groups that have taken his work, who've gotten U.S. aid, and who have done things that are not, not things I agree with. I've seen no proof to that, and I think you would be upset if in 20 years some group, for whatever reason, took something that you had written, got U.S. aid for it, and did things you didn't like, if people started calling you a government agent. So unless you have some kind of proof, I would caution you from saying that.
Well, I don't want to have a whole discussion with Gene, which may be impossible to avoid, but I'll just say this about it. I was teaching his book, Making Europe Unconquerable, and somebody brought in his pamphlet From Dictatorship to Democracy, saying that it was being distributed widely in the color revolutions. And it turned out that it was in 21 languages that they knew of. It's actually in 5 different languages, 5 different dialects at the top. Now, he does have the Albert Einstein Foundation in Cambridge, but I would guess offhand that even with all the linguistics at Harvard, you might have trouble putting something in 21 languages. And the Comintern used to do this. Authors not famous in the United States would have their novels widely published, and some who were justifiably famous. But they would get into 30 languages. But it's very hard. In fact, I know of only one organization in the world at this point that is likely to have put that little pamphlet into many, many, many languages. And I have several students look into it, and if you want to discuss it afterwards, Gene says this, and defenders of Gene say this. Personally, I think he's made American foreign policy less violent, and I'm happy about that. But as far as it goes, I also think that there's a tremendous price which has been paid, and that one had best be very careful with the view that it's just people with, maybe a machine somewhere, dittoing this up. I think that that is so implausible as to be terminally unlikely. It depends why people are saying something, right? So I said it sarcastically, but I wasn't saying it because I haven't thought about it, or because I haven't thought about your objection. Remember that I'm like Gandhi, so I'm not actually in favor of calling names.
Okay, in her too.
Roshan.
So, I have a lot of questions that I would like to ask, but I want to keep it on militant nonviolence, which is, something that you've been advocating for. I have, it's partly a comment and partly a question, just like my reactions. It seems to me that militant nonviolence, a la Martin Luther King and Gandhi, involved a lot of organizations from churches, or Hindu churches. I'm not sure of their names, sorry. But there was a lot of religious involved. There was a lot of training that went on in faith communities, and there was already kind of organizations that supported its militancy, which really just means like organized, and committed. And Occupy has no such religious wings. There's affiliated faith organizations, but I mean, on the scale of those two movements, there isn't an analog right now for the Occupy movement. And I have thought about, how do we get a large group? I mean, for the marches that used to happen for 15 weeks straight downtown, those are just kind of like, hey, come if you want. And there was no, training, there was no organization of the actual people who would show up. And so for them to be nonviolent meant that it had to be from their own personal commitments, their own backgrounds, and just their own personalities. And for those who are violent, same difference. So to call for mass militant nonviolence from the Occupy movement as a commitment to that kind of tactic for their strategy is to call upon the Occupy movement to do something that it right now doesn't have the capacity to do, which is commit a bunch of people to the same idea militantly to the point where they will suffer physical harm in the face of violating that commitment. Do you have a good suggestion for how the Occupy movement could achieve that sort of thing? Because that's just my question is, it's one thing to say you should be massively militantly nonviolent. It's a whole hell of another thing to actually be that.
Right. This is a very good question. So look, think about the people in Oakland who spent a lot of time fighting the police. They were willing to risk stuff. A lot of them got hurt, some terribly. And it's a real issue in any serious movement. If you are breathing in a large demonstration against the American ruling class, at some point, particularly you non-white, they are likely to take you out, or they're going to take somebody out. That's the first point. Second point is, yeah, there's a lot of religion in movements, some movements. It's a strength and a weakness. So as far as it goes, one of the best pieces on nonviolence is written by Barbara Deming, and it is called Revolution and Equilibrium, and she read Franz Fanon very carefully, and she answers it. And anybody who's interested in the topic should make it a point to get her pamphlet. It's gem-like. It's like Thoreau's Civil Disobedience. You really learn something from it. Or it's like King's letter from the Birmingham City Jail. You might really get something out of it. So one of the things is that you don't learn how to have a movement until you get the idea that it's important to have a movement. So look, the great thing about movements is they just happen. So I went with my wife on January 15, 2003 to Washington, D.C. And 500,000 people came and they filled up the whole mall. It was bigger than the famous March with Martin Luther King, which I saw once upon a time, and the buses were still coming in. And we all realized, hey, we're not the minority, we're the majority. This is not a popular war. There were talking heads who were for the war, and there are people who argue with you about the war. I had people try to hurt me when I was against the Vietnam War at the outset. And I was on television debating people, and the only people who came up to talk to me pretty much, people liked what I said. And there was one guy who didn't, but I chased him off by looking cross-eyed at him. So it didn't seem that he intimidated me. So one of the things about this is we had all these people, and the group that organized it were Trotsky's, and in particular the Workers' World Group. And they were so happy because they had 500,000 people. They were delirious. And so the Bush administration had taken away their permit to go to the Washington Naval Yard. So they had everybody go march by the Naval Yard and get back on the buses and go home. So I'm afraid that my idea of what you do and get 500,000 people in front of the White House when there's a good chance of preventing the war, and the New York Times reporter is left at 10 in the morning and said organizers are disappointed because there only 10,000 people came, and the National Public Radio, we used to call it National Pentagon Radio around my house during the run-up to the war, said the same thing. They apologized the following Wednesday and said there were 100,000. So they got, fifth rate maybe. So anyway, I talked to everybody I knew from Colorado and everybody else I could talk to about, hey, we are going by the White House like sardines. Why don't we sit down around the White House? If 20,000 of us had sat down around the White House, that'd be a big deal. If 100,000 of us had sat down around the White House and there was a lot of feeling about the war and a lot of anger about what had happened, it could be a lot better. The reason we didn't do it, because a lot of people wanted to, was that there weren't enough organized people from below to do it. Not because people wouldn't have done it. If you look at Tahrir Square, a lot of people came out and they did heroic things and they fought to defend the square. Were they organized with militant, nonviolent tactics? No. Hey, could they have picked them up? Yeah. As for Gene, his pamphlet was sort of circulating around the edges. The New York Times ran a big story about how this guy in his little room with an Afghan woman, trying to connect up to the internet because he can't, shakes the world. But the truth is that a lot of people were interested. And by the way, as far as it goes, in that case, Gene was sort of helpful. And that, I'm not really a fan of his political allegiances. His trans-partisan position doesn't mean he's never done any good things. So I would say about this that it is precisely through thinking about real situations. We had thousands of people out here. Now, it was the most militant thing we could have done that a bunch of people in the Black Bloc got together and locked arms and threw some rocks, or, balloons of urine, or whatever it was. Or, seriously, or that people sat in blocked traffic. Was that the most militant thing to do? Or could everybody, with stacking and talking and suggesting, have come up with a few more things if anybody set them the thought, nobody else is going to do this, we can do it, why not us? You want to come back on that?
I didn't hear a good suggestion for how to make a friendly algorithm